Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed Tes, Daf 39, Masechta Beitzah. Friends, what does Daf 39 talk about? Well, two Mishnayos. More discussions of Eruvei Tchumen. Masechta Beitzah really goes out in exciting sugyas over here. Alright, well, what do you want me to tell you? This is what we got over here. Eruvei Tchumen. So, taking out coals and flames, how do we govern the laws of Eruvei Tchumen in terms of when it comes to coals and flames? Okie dokie. What about pits? If you have a pit of water, if you chop around some of the water, so how far can you take it? Well, let's jump in and find out. We're on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Aleph at the Mishnah, about 8-9 lines into the page. So a coal can be taken as far as the fellow who owns the coal. So if Reuven owns a coal and Shimon chaps it around, so he could only take it as far as Shimon, where he's limited by Shimon. Shimon is limited by Reuven, who's the owner of the coal. Shimon is limited by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos, or in this case Yom Tov. However, interestingly, this does not apply to the flame. So let's say Reuven had a candle, and Shimon has a candle, and Shimon lights his candle from Reuven's candle. So basically, he's kind of, in a sense, like taking Reuven's flame, or at least from Reuven's flame. Nonetheless, Shimon can take his candle as far as he wants, even though he has a flame which originated from Reuven's flame. That doesn't matter, right? Shalev is b'chol makom. The flame can be taken wherever you want. Okay. Gacheles shel hekdish mayalim ba. If you have a coal that belongs to hekdish, it belongs to the Beis Hamikdash. So if you get benefit from it, so there's a din me'ilo, you'd have to bring a korban osher me'ilis. V'shalheves lo nenim v'lo mo'alin. When it comes to the flame of hekdish, so I guess if you have like a coal or something and it has a flame, or a candle and it has a flame, so that flame you should not get benefit from it. Midirabanan, technically speaking you can, but the rabbis say that we don't want you to, v'lo mo'alin, but you're not gonna, if you get benefit from it, so from the flame, so then you don't need to bring an osher me'ilis. It's not osher midoraisa to get benefit from this flame. The rabbis don't want you to get benefit from the flame, so they say lo nenin, don't get benefit from it, but if you do, v'lo mo'alin, you don't have to bring a korban osher me'ilos. Hamotzi gacheles l'shus harabim chayev v'shalheves potter. A fellow who chaps around a coal and he takes it from inside of his house to the Rishus Harabim, as we know, of course, from Masechta Shabbos and Masechta Eruvin, from what we know from a lot of the sort of first 9 months of Babylon Talmud, with Masechta Shabbos, Masechta Eruvin, you're not allowed to take anything from Rishus Yachid to Rishus Harabim, assuming it's a certain shear, whatever it is. We're saying that a coal, do not take a coal from Rishus Yachid to Rishus Harabim, V'shalev is potter. But a flame, if a flame is taken from Rishus Yachid to Rishus Harabim, you are potter, and the Gemara is going to explain what that means. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, says the Gemara. There are 5 things that are said about a coal. Alright, who's ready? That the coal can be taken, the Tchum Shabbos or Yom Tov of a coal is defined by the owner of the coal. Okay. V'shalev is b'chol makom, whereas the flame can be taken wherever, as we saw in the Mishnah. Gacheles shel hekdish mo'alin ba. A coal that belongs to the Beis Hamikdash has a din me'ila. If you get benefit from the coal, so then you have to bring a korban osher me'ilis. V'shaleves lo nenim v'lo ma'alin, whereas a flame you cannot get benefit from it, but if you do, you do not need to bring a korban osher me'ilos, because it's only osher midirabanan, not midoraisa. Gacheles shel avodah zarah. If you have a coal of avodah zarah, asura, so you're not allowed to get any benefit from that coal because it's avodah zarah. V'shaleves muteris, but the flame is permitted. And the Gemara is going to ask, how come avodah zarah flame is permitted, whereas hektish flame is Potter avalos, How come the rabbis made an isur midrabanan by hekdesh but not by avodah zarah? We'll see that in a minute. Hamotzi gacheles l'shus harabim chayiv v'shalev es pater. A fellow who takes a coal from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, so it's going to be chayiv to be a korban chatos v'shalev es pater. Whereas if he takes a flame from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, he's pater. He does not have to bring a korban chatos. Hamudrano mechavero. If Ruvain says, I am not going to get any benefit from Shimon, also begachelto, well then he's not allowed to use Shimon's coals. Umutu b'shalevto, but he's permitted to get benefit from Shimon's flame. Alright. Maishna shaleves avodah zarah desharia. How come we say that the flame of avodah zarah is 100, maybe even 1000% permitted? Umaishna dehektish dasir. How come when it comes to the flame of hektish, the rabbi said we don't want you getting benefit from them, right? From the flame of hektish. Even though technically speaking you're allowed to get benefit from the flame of hektish, but the rabbis say that we don't want you to get benefit from the flame of hektish. Now, but by avodah zarah, they don't say that. They say it's muteris. How come? So avodah zarah de meiso v'dili inshe mina logazu barabanan. Look, avodah zarah is already gross and disgusting and taboo, and people stay away from it on their own. So the rabbis didn't need to add on a gezer derabanan, stay away from the flame of avodah zarah. People are staying away from it anyways. It's gross. Logazu barabanan. Hektish to lomois v'lo b'dili inshemine logazu barabanan. But there's nothing disgusting about hektish. There's nothing disgusting about something that was donated to the Beis HaMikdash. That sounds beautiful. It sounds gishmak. It sounds givaldik. So therefore, everybody's going to want to get on board. So therefore, the rabbis had to say, hey, people, stay back. We're talking about a flame of hektish over here. We don't want you getting benefit from it. So because everybody would jump to the opportunity to get benefit from hektish, so therefore they had to say, look, stay back. We don't want you getting benefit from this flame of hektish. They did not need to institute such a thing by avodah zarah. Nobody wants to deal with avodah zarah anyways. Okay. So, we said in our Mishnah that if a fellow brings a coal from Rishus HaYachid out to Rishus HaRabim, so he's chayiv for hotzah. V'shalev is potter. However, if he brings a flame from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, he is patur. V'otanya, 1 second. We have a brayrah that says, Amotzi shaleves kol shu chayiv. Friends, what do we do? Our Mishnah says that what does the Mishnah say? That somebody who takes a flame from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim is potter. Yeah, we have a brayrah that says that somebody who takes a flame, kol shu, any amount, no matter how big or small, if he takes it out from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, he's chayiv. So if Sheshis explains the brayrah as saying, that brayrah, when it says that you're chayiv, it's because you're taking out a wood chip that has a flame on it, right? So you have there's a wood chip that is ignited, that has a flame on it, because the flame is not just a flame on its own; it's a flame together with a wood chip that gives the flame significance. And because the flame has significance, you're going to be chayiv if you take it from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim. V'tepek mishum kesem. So, frek the Gemara, but why? It sounds to me, asks the Gemara, that you're chayiv in that case not for taking out a flame, but for taking out a wood chip. Well, as we know from Masechta Shabbos, everything on Shabbos has to have a certain amount, and we're saying that the wood chip is not enough of an amount to be chayiv for taking out wood. Titanan, as we learn in the Mishnah, that in order to be chayiv for taking out wood on Shabbos from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, there has to be enough wood to cook, to be able to light and to cook an egg. So this wood chip is not quite enough wood to cook an egg, but it does give prominence and significance to the flame, and therefore you'll be chayiv for taking out the flame. Abaye says that what it's talking about is where you take a vessel and you smother the vessel in oil and you light the oil and then you take that out. That is the case where you will be chayev for taking out a flame. Typically mishum mana. But why don't we say that you're chayev for taking out the vessel? Bechaspa. Well, it's talking about earthenware vessel. Typically mishum chaspa. So say that you're chayev for taking out an earthenware vessel. Well, it's not big enough. That in order to be chayev for taking out earthenware, there has to be enough earthenware to put between different boards. I don't know, like boards around your window. If they're like uneven, you would put some pottery there or something. However much pottery you would put in those boards, so then that's the minimum amount to be chayev on Shabbos. If you're Rabbi Yehuda, that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. So, okay, so it says Abai, it's talking about some vessel, some earthenware vessel that you smother in oil and you light it, and it's not quite enough earthenware to be chayev for hotzah, but because there's the flame, because you ignited a flame on it, so the flame is, you can be chayev for taking out the flame. Okay, fine. Well, if that's the case, our Mishnah had said that if you take a flame out from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, you're potter. So then what's that case talking about? It's talking about where you like blow it out to Rishus HaRabim. Let's say you have a flame in Rishus HaYachid and you use your hand, let's say, to, I don't know, somehow you use your hand maybe to like fan it, let's say, and then like a spark goes flying from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim. So that spark that goes flying from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim will not be considered hotzah. Alright, sounds very nice. But if you take out a vessel with a flame on it, you are going to be chayev. Don't do it. Says the Mishnah, Bor shel yachid kiragli ayachid. Alright, if you have a fellow, and this fellow has a pit, lucky guy. So you have a fellow, he's got a pit, big mahatzit, and so that water in this fellow's pit, the tehum Shabbos is based on that fellow. So Ruvain's got a pit. The water, I guess if anybody draws water from that pit, so they will be able to take that water only to places within Ruvain's tehum Shabbos. Okay? And if there is a pit belonging to paper boy, so if there's a pit belonging to a particular city, so then the tehum Shabbos is governed by 2,000 amos around that city. Okay. Now, I think, where was the first time that we saw this kiragle, the Oli Bavel thing? Was it maybe in Erevin? Yeah, Mistama, right? Was that the Diomdin? I don't know. Anyways, so the people who would be Ola Regel to come to Yerushalayim from Bavel, so they would make these like pits along the way so that they would have water. So, when you draw water from those pits, so whose tehum Shabbos is it governed by? So we say kiragle memale. It's governed by however far the fellow who filled up the water can go. So if Ruvain fills up water from this Babylonian pilgrim pit along the way, so Ruvain filled up water, so that water can go 2,000 amos, around wherever Ruvain was kona shvisa, wherever Ruvain can go, that's where the water can go. But if he then gives the water to Shimon can't take it wherever he can go. No, it's going to be governed by the mamale. It's governed by whoever fills it up. In this case, it's Ruvain. The water can go as far as Ruvain can go. Frekte Gemara, Romile Ravili Rav Nachman, Ravi as Akasha Tezebi Rav Nachman Tnan. We learn in our Mishnah, Bor shel Yochid Kiragle Ayochid. So if you have a pit belonging to Ruvain, so the water in that pit is able to travel on Shabbos or Yom Tov only as far as Ruvain himself can travel. Alright? We're talking about Yom Tov because how would you be able to carry it on Shabbos? Fine. Kiragle Ayochid. V'raminu, we have a kasha. Nairis Hamoshin, if you have a river that flows, or Mayanos Hanovim, or you have a stream that flows, I guess, Harein Kiragle Kol Adam, they're based on the Kiragle Kol Adam. they are based, you can go anywhere, essentially, right? So now the interesting thing there is Mayanos Hanovin. So a Mayan, a stream, it sounds to me kind of like a lake. It's a body of water that has defined boundaries, almost like a pit, right? Reuven's got a pit in his courtyard. The pit has defined boundaries. Now you have this Ma'ayan, this stream, also has defined boundaries. And we're saying that the stream is Kiragle Kol Adam. What Kiragle Kol Adam means is that it can go anywhere. As long as anywhere you're allowed to go, it can go. So if you have this stream and Reuven fills up some water, so he could take it wherever he's allowed to go in terms of his Tchum Shabbos. If Reuven then gives the water to Shimon, Shimon can take it wherever he can go. If he gives it to Levi can take it wherever he can go. It's Kiragle Kol Adam. It's not limited to any one particular person's Tchum Shabbos. Only the person who is in possession of it right now can take it as far as he's allowed to go. Now this is different than what our Mishnah says, which is by a pit in a fellow's property. So that water can only be taken as far as that fellow can go. If Reuven's got a pit, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, whoever chapsarain water from the pit is limited in taking that water only to places that Reuven, who owns the pit, would be allowed to go. So why on the one hand are we saying by Reuven's pit that the Tchum Shabbos is defined by Reuven, whereas by a stream, which apparently is also a delineated body of water, a specific area that has water, and like almost sounds to me like a lake, we're saying over there that it's Kiragle Kol Adam. It's not limited to any one particular person's Tchum Shabbos. So So Rabba answers, right? It says Rava, but Rava's one asks the Kasha. There's a different gears that says Rabba, other gears that say even Rav Nachman responds to Rava. It's a little bit hard to understand, I guess, who's saying what, but the answer is that, well, with Reuven's pit, that is gathered water as opposed to flowing water. Flowing water is Kiragle Kol Adam. Moving water is Kiragle Kol Adam, but gathered together water, like Reuven's pit, is going to be Kiragle Abaylim. Itmar Nami, it was also stated, Amar B'chia Bar Oven, says B'chia Bar Oven, the Arish B'chabura, the line of the group, Amar Shmuel ben Mechunosin. Yeah, our mission is talking about water that is gathered together, not running lively waters, and that's why it is limited by the fellow who owns the pit. Okay, well, it was a very nice sugya, right? Okay, and now the Mishnah had continued and said, Vishal ole bavel kiragle memale. Wow. So we had said that these pits that were constructed by the people, the pilgrims from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, that on the way, when they would travel from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, they would have these pits where they'd be able to chapara in water. So whoever fills it up, that's how it's governed. So if Reuven fills up water from this ole Bavel pit, so that water can go as far as Reuven can go. Reuven's got his 2,000 amos in any direction. That water can go 2,000 amos in any direction from where Reuven was when Shabbos began. Now, Itmar mili v'nosan l'chaveru ho. So Reuven fills up water from the ole regalim, the ole Bavel pit, for Shimon. So Reuven fills up water from this pit for Shimon. Now on the one hand we said that it's Kiragle Memale. The one hand we said that it's based on Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. But he filled it up for Shimon. What do we do in this case? So Rav Nachman Amar Kiragle Mishin is Malalo. Look, Rav Nachman says Givaldik, that Reuven could fill up the water for Shimon, and the Tchum Shabbos is defined by Shimon, by wherever Shimon can go. Rav Sheshes Amar Kiragle Memale, whereas Rav Sheshes says no. If Reuven fills it up, I don't care that it's for Shimon. It's defined by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. Okay, what's the point of the machlo? What are they arguing about? Marsover brayrah defkerehu, marsover brayrah deshutvehu. So if Sheshes says, well, we treat this pit is hefker, that the ole bavel, they constructed these pits of water, and they are hefker. They don't belong to any one person. They're ownerless. And therefore, if Sheshes says that Mimele, when Reuven picks up, draws the water, he memele automatically becomes the owner of this water, and it's his, and he's kona it. And therefore, the water is going to be limited by where Reuven, can go. I don't care that he gives it to Shimon, it's too late. It's ownerless water. Reuven draws the water, he becomes the owner. The Tchum Shabbos is based on him. I don't care that he gives it to Shimon. Whereas, Whereas Rav Nachman says that's not the right way to look at it. The truth is that the pits are partner pits, meaning the pilgrims from Babylonia, when they constructed these pits, they said, not that we're constructing these pits and nobody owns them, it's ownerless. No, the opposite. We're constructing these pits and everybody owns it. Memela, everybody owns a certain portion of it. Everybody has a right to it. Everybody is an owner. And therefore, what is happening in effect here is that Shimon is saying to Reuven, I'm making you my messenger to draw my water that is rightfully mine from the pit. And Reuven then goes as a faithful messenger, draws water from the pit that is rightfully right, that Shimon has a right to. Reuven draws this water as the messenger of Shimon and gives it to Shimon. In that case, it's defined by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. So therefore, there are two ways to look at this pilgrim pit. One is to say that it's completely ownerless and therefore anybody could take it. And therefore, Rav Sheshes says, well, if it's ownerless, when Reuven picks it up, Memele, he becomes the owner of it and it's going to be defined by his Tchum Shabbos. Whereas Rav Nachman says, no, the pilgrim pit is jointly owned by everybody. And therefore what's happening actually is that Shimon is making Reuven his messenger to draw water for him and bringing it to him, and it's going to be defined by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. Gewaldig. Eisvir of Rav Nachman. Ho 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 ho. So now Rave asks the kasha on Rav Nachman. Again, Rav Nachman says that the pit is a pit, it belongs to everybody. All Yidden are partners in this pit. Rava says, wait. Hareni alecha cherim. I am upon you a cherim. Meaning, Reuven says to Shimon, stay away from me. You cannot get any benefit from me whatsoever. Hamuder aser. Well, there goes that. Shimon is no longer allowed to get benefit from anything that belongs to Reuven. Hare'ato olai cherim. If Reuven says to Shimon, you are to me a cherim, i.e., I will not get any benefit whatsoever from you. Hanoder aser. Well, okay, Reuven is in fact not allowed to get any benefit from Shimon. Hareni alecha v'ato olai shnei masurim zeboze. Now what if Reuven creates a big mess by saying that you are not allowed to get any benefit from me, and I am not allowed to get any benefit from you? Well, that's a nice little mess. It's mutual. Reuven can't get any benefit from Shimon. Shimon can't get any benefit from Reuven. Now, this can create some complications. Now, they are nonetheless permitted to get benefit from Ole Bavel, which we're going to have to explain what that means. But they're forbidden within their respective cities. We're going to explain what this means. These are the things of the pilgrims from Bavel that they are allowed to get benefit from. Harabayas, okay, they'd both be allowed to get benefit from the Temple Mount. Halashachos, the different offices there in the Azaros, and what are Azaros? I don't know, sanctuaries? No, not really sanctuaries. Areas. I don't know. Areas in the Beis Hamikdash. Uvor shel emtza haderech. You hear that? That's the important part. That's the key. That's the kicker. Uvor shel emtza haderech. The pilgrim pits. They're allowed to get benefit from the pilgrim pits, even though they said that they won't be getting benefit from each other. Which means, memele, that by getting benefit from the pilgrim pits, they are not getting benefit from something that belongs to somebody else. They're not getting benefit, right? When Reuven chapsarain from the pilgrim pit, he's not taking anything from Shimon. He's not getting any benefit from Shimon. So we're going to have to tie that in a second. But basically, if we take our examples, if we're saying that the pilgrim pits are jointly owned by everybody, well then how could we say that Reuven's allowed to take from the pit? Memele, it's also jointly owned by Shimon, which means he's going to be getting benefit from Shimon. But if we say that it's hefker, it's ownerless, okay, now I understand. Of course Reuven can get benefit from the pit. There's no owners. Shimon has nothing to do with it. Okay, let's go weiter. We also said that anything in their city that they live in, right? They both live in the same city, so they cannot get benefit from different things in the city because they're jointly owned by everybody in the city, including themselves. Rechova, the plaza of the city, okay. Uveis HaKnesses, the temple, the synagogue. Uveis HaMerchatz, and the bathhouse. Oof, yikes! All right, I guess they didn't see that one coming. Probably didn't think that through enough when Reuven decided that they weren't going to get benefit from each other. They can't bathe anymore, because that's all shared space. And if they're not allowed to get benefit from each other, well, if they both have a portion in these shared spaces, well then, memele, when you go to the bathhouse, well, the bathhouse, Shimon is a partner in the bathhouse. So if Reuven goes to the bathhouse, he's memele getting benefit from Shimon. He said he's not going to get benefit from Shimon, so he's not allowed. And if, Rav Nachman, you're arguing that the pilgrim pits are jointly owned by all the Yidden, well, amai mutter, well then, why would Reuven be able to use it? V'atnan, right? I mean, or even Shimon for that matter, but let's just go from the perspective of Kilu, because they neither are allowed to get benefit from each other, right? So why are they allowed to use the pilgrim pit? V'atnan, don't we learn in the Mishnah, Hashutfin, when you have partners, Shenodru Anoah Zemizeh, you have partners and Mistama, things probably went sour. And they said, that's it. I'm not getting benefit from you. You're not getting benefit from me. That's it. Assume the kanis l'chotzer, lechos bebor. So, now that they have decided that they're not getting benefit from each other, well, they cannot go into their jointly owned courtyard to use their jointly owned pit. Because since it's jointly owned, memele, right, to bathe in there. So memele, when you jump into the pit, you're getting benefit, right? Reuven jumps into the pit, he's getting benefit from a pit that, that Shimon also has a part in. So therefore he's getting benefit from Shimon as well when he jumps into that pit. So, hachinami. So Nachman answers by saying, Ravit, you're asking a good question. You're asking a very good question. It's true that if Reuven and Shimon jointly own a pit, Reuven would not be allowed to jump into there if they decided they're not getting benefit from each other, because it's true. When Reuven jumps into the pit, he'll be getting benefit from something that is also jointly owned by Shimon. But, and you know what? The same would be true by the pilgrim pit. By the pilgrim pit, Rav Nachman's saying, I still hold that the pilgrim pit is jointly owned by everybody, by all the Yidden. And if Reuven would jump into the pilgrim pit, it would be a problem, because that pilgrim pit is also owned by Shimon, and Reuven would thereby be getting benefit from something that Shimon is a partner in. However, what are we talking about specifically by the pilgrim pit? Limalos. We're not talking about to jump in and bathe. We're talking about to fill up some water so you could drink it. Rav Nachman says, look, the pilgrim pit is jointly owned by everybody. But we're talking about filling up water. That we're saying that Reuven is allowed to go to the pilgrim pit and fill up water, because when he fills it up, we'll say brayrah. We'll go back and Photoshop it and say, well, Memele, at the time that he drew the water, he drew his water. Everybody has a portion in this pit. Reuven has a portion, Shimon has a portion. Everyone's allowed to take water. So Memele, Reuven, when he takes water, he's not taking Shimon's water. We're going to say that Memele, he took his own water. And when Shimon takes water, Memele is taking his own water. So it's not like when they jump, it's not like bathing in the pit where you're using all of the water. No, you're drawing out just one part of the water. And we'll say that one part of the water is Memele, the part that you own. And therefore, Rav Nachman maintains that this pit is jointly owned by everybody, and that the reason why it's not a problem when Reuven and Shimon are not allowed to get benefit from each other is because Reuven is just taking Reuven's water. Shimon is just taking Shimon's water. They are not benefiting from one another. But fact the Gemara, V'savar Rav Nachman yesh brayrah. But the Gemara asks, but obviously this means then that Rav Nachman holds of brayrah. So obviously this means that Rav Nachman holds of brayrah, to say that when Ruvain chapsarain water from the pilgrim pit, we're saying, oh, he's definitely taking his own water. There is no chance that he's taking Shimon's water. He is taking his own water. We're going to say brayrah. We're going to go back, Photoshop it, and say that, yes, certainly at the time that he drew the water, he was drawing his own water. Okay. V'atnan, but 1 second. I'll prove to you that Rav Nachman does not hold of brayrah, because we have a Mishnah that says, Achin ashutfin. Okay, fun times. The interesting thing is that we had this Gemara in Masechta Shkalim. Masechta Shkalim was an extremely difficult Masechta. I'd say 90% of the difficult, 80 to 90% of the difficulty of that Masechta is that it's Yerushalmi and that there's like no Rashi, like it's just, you're kind of on your own. That and it just happens to be difficult. So it was interesting actually to see this Gemara that we saw in Shkalim, which was so hard, and now to see it in Masechta Beitzah, in Bavli, where we actually have more tools. We have Rashi, it's in like Aramaic that we are accustomed to, and to work through it, it was still complicated, it's still complex, but it's just another Gemara. Whereas in Yerushalmi, this is like, are you serious? You really expect me to figure this out without any tools? But over here we have tools, we have Rashi, a lot of Rashi, but so it's interesting to see how a complicated sugya in Shkalim is actually more or less manageable in just regular Bavli. So Achin Ashutfin. Okay, so you have brothers Reuven and Shimon, and their father passed away, Yaakov. Yaakov passes away. Reuven and Shimon now divide up the estate. Okay, fine. Reuven gets what he gets, Shimon gets what he gets. But now then they come back and re-merge the estate so that it's all now jointly owned. Okay, so Yaakov had all sorts of assets. When he passed away, they got divided in half among Reuven and Shimon. Reuven and Shimon now decide that they want to pool together the assets once again. Now there are nafkaminas, particularly in these two areas, maaser behaymah and the kalbon. What are these two things? So the kalbon is that, so we learned in Masechta Shkalim that every yid has to donate a mahatzit, hashekel, a half shekel to the Beis Hamikdash. Now the thing is that these half shekels can get lost. So they would sort of transfer them to be a larger denomination, a larger coin, so that it wouldn't get lost. Now the thing is, when you take it to the money changer to change, so he takes a certain fee, takes a certain cut. So the question is, who should cover the cost of the money changer? Are we going to say that the Beis Hamikdash loses out when you're changing the half shekel into a larger denomination? Or do you, as the donator, cover it? The answer is you, as the donator, cover it. And that's what's called the kalbon fee, this extra kalbon fee. So when you have a mahatzit hashekel, so you also add to it this kalbon fee, which is essentially the money changer's fee. Now, if two people partner together to bring a mahatzit hashekel, so they're essentially bringing a whole shekel, so this larger denomination maybe arguably doesn't need the kalbon because it's already a larger denomination. You can bypass the money changer. But we say no, nonetheless, even when two people bring their mahatzit shekel together, so they're essentially bringing a complete shekel and they don't need the money changer, still they would bring the kalbon. Okay? Now there's an exception to that rule, which is that a father who's bringing mahatzit shekels for his two sons, so he's bringing essentially a whole shekel between his two sons, half shekel each, a whole shekel total. He does not need to bring the kalbon. Okay, fine. Now, maaser behaymah. What's maaser behaymah? Maaser behaymah is that you have your animals, so then you have to take 1 out of every 10 animals, and it's maaser, 1/10, right? 1 out of every 10 animals you take as maaser, you bring it to the Beis Hamikdash, you offer it as a korban, and you can eat it. Fine. Now, okay, givaldik. 10% of your animals you bring to the Beis Hamikdash and you bring as korbanos. If you have a partnership though, if you have a partnership, two people are in business together, they jointly own animals, you're pater from maaser behaymah. Okay, so your own animals, you have to separate maaser behaymah, but if you're in a partnership, then you don't need to separate maaser behaymah. Okay, givaldik. Let's also define one more thing, which is that when Yaakov dies, so then when Yaakov dies, basically all of his assets are what's called tfisas habayis, I guess owned by the estate. And when it is owned by the estate, it's essentially, right before it's divided up, it's essentially owned by Yaakov still. Okay? And therefore, if it's still owned by Yaakov, right? Okay, fine. So when Yaakov dies, it's the assets are what's called like tfisas habayis, fine. And then when they're divided up among Reuven and Shimon, so then they're no longer called tfisas habayis. Okay, fine. Now, if we take a look at maaser behaymah and kalbon, so when the assets are still in tfisas habayis, right? So Yaakov dies, Reuven and Shimon haven't yet divided up the assets, so it's still as though it's in Yaakov's possession. So if Reuven and Shimon were to separate a half a shekel each from Yaakov's assets to bring as the mahatzit hashekel, well, it would be pater from the kalbon, just like if Yaakov would pay Reuven and Shimon's mahatzit hashekel, so it would be pater from the kalbon. So if once Yaakov dies and the property is still in this state that's called tfisas habayis, it's essentially still Yaakov's possession. So then if Reuven and Shimon take a shekel for both, for the total of their mahatzit hashekel donations, they would be pater from a kalbon since it's coming from Yaakov's possessions. However, at the same time, they would be chayav, right? Any new animals that are born to the flock, they would be chayav to bring maaser behaymah because their relationship, their joint relationship, their joint ownership of these animals are not like a business partnership. Rather, they're just coming from the father's assets, and it would still be chayav in maaser behaymah. Okay. Now, if they would have an actual partnership together, right? If Reuven and Shimon would take all these assets and go into business together, so in that case, they're now partners. And if they take their two mahatzit hashekels from their joint partnership, well, that's just like any two partners who are bringing two mahatzit hashekels together, and they would be chayav to bring the kalbon. However, as partners, they would be pater from maaser behaymah, because as we said, partners are pater from maaser behaymah. So now to kind of bring everything together. So what we're talking about here is that Yaakov in our example died. Okay. Now, when he dies, all of his assets, all of his properties, what's called tfisas habayis, it's essentially still as though it's Yaakov's. We're talking about a case where Reuven and Shimon then divided up the estate in half. Okay. And then they came back together and repooled it together as partners. And the question is, now that they came back together as partners, so do we view this as a business partnership? And now that they all jointly own Reuven and Shimon now jointly own all the assets together as business partners, so they'll be pater from maaser behaymah, but they'll be chayav in the kalbon? Or do we say that when they repool together their assets, it just reverts back to like before they divided up in the first place? And it essentially goes back to being tfisas habayis, right? It was tfisas habayis when Yaakov died. They divided it in half, but then brought it back together. It just goes back to how it was before, in which case they would be pater from the kalbon, but they'd be chayav in maaser behaymah. Alright, let's see. So achin hashutfin. So if you have these brothers who are, partners, right? So you have Yaakov dies, Reuven and Shimon are the inheritors. Kishachayovin bekalbon. So when they will be chayav, so if we're saying that in this partnership they're chayav in a kalbon, i.e. we view them as just regular business partners, so p'turin maaser behaymah, well then they're pater from maaser behaymah, because as business partners, they don't have to bring maaser behaymah. But if they're chayiv in maaser behaymah, i.e., we view their pooling of assets, they're coming back together as partners, as though it just reverts to being the tfisas habayis. Well then, so they're patur from maaser behaymah. They can be chayiv in maaser behaymah, but p'turim min hakabon, but they'll be patur from the kabon, because essentially they're just bringing the mahatzit hashekels from like their father's assets essentially, and therefore they're patur from the kabon. So, okay. V'amar Rav Anan, and says Rav Anan, lo shanu, when do we say that when they pool together their assets after having divided it up, when do we say that it's considered a business partnership and they'd be patur from maaser behaymah and chayiv in the kabon? Ela shechalku gedim keneged tloim utloim keneged gedim. Well, it depends how they divided up the estate. Says Rav Anan that if they divided up the estate in such a way that the normal way to divide up the estate would simply be to say that they divide everything in half. If there are sheep and there are goats, so they would say, look, Reuven gets half the sheep, Shimon gets half the sheep, Reuven gets half the goats, Shimon gets half the goats. But if they didn't divide it up like that, rather they said, look, they took a look, they evaluated the sheep, and they said, look, at the end of the day, the sheep are worth half the assets, right, worth 50%. They took a look at all the goats, and they said, look, the goats are worth also 50% of the value. Reuven, why don't you take the sheep? Shimon, why don't you take the goats? So in that case, it's not like a normal kind of obvious way of like dividing everything in half. It's more like they evaluated it, they did a cheshbon, they said, look, if you take the sheep and I take the goats, so then Memela will have the same thing. So if you divide up the estate in that way, when they repool their assets, they come back into it not as inheritors, but as business partners. That they initially divided up the estate in a way that wasn't, obviously what their inheritance was. If they would split everything in half, right? You get half the sheep, and I get half the sheep, you get half the goats, and I get half the goats. Well then, the sheep that, each one of them got, and the goats that each one of them got is their true inheritance. What was coming to them from the inheritance? 50% of everything. But if they do it a little bit differently, where they just evaluate that, look, if you take all the sheep and I take all the goats, Memela it'll be the same thing. Well, then that's not what their like sort of automatic inheritance would have been. Their automatic inheritance would have been 50 of each. But they divide it up in that way where they kind of say, the value of the sheep is yours and the value of the goats is mine. When they then pool them together as a joint partnership, it's as though they're each coming with their own assets into a business partnership, and they're now business partners, and they'll be chayiv in the kalbon, but patur from maaser behaymah. Okay? So again, of Amar of Anan, when we say that they're viewed as business partners, lo shanu ela shechalku gedim keneged tloim, when they divided up the goats and the sheep, tloim keneged gedim, and the sheep by the goats, so kilo they say, Reuven, you could take all the sheep, Shimon, you could take all the goats, it's the same value. Aval, chalku gedim keneged gedim, tloim keneged tloim, but if Reuven got 50% of the goats, and Shimon got 50% of the goats, and Reuven got 50% of the sheep, and Shimon got 50% of the sheep, well, in that case, Omrim, we say, Zeu chelko amagio mishor rishon lechach. It says of Anan, if they divide up the assets, mamish 50-50, that Reuven gets half the sheep, Shimon gets half the sheep, Reuven gets half the goats, Shimon gets half the goats, well, in that case, Rav Anan is going to say, we'll say brayrah. We'll say, well, Reuven will assume that the 50% of the goats that Reuven got was the 50% of the goats that he was supposed to get. There is no chance that Reuven got the 50% that was supposed to be Shimon's, or that Shimon got the 50% that was supposed to be Reuven's. No, Memela will say Reuven got what he was supposed to get all along. Shimon got what he was supposed to get all along. And the same thing with the sheep, right? So the 50% of the sheep, the 50% of the goats that they each get was the portion that they were supposed to get. And in that case, each one basically is in possession of their inheritance. And when they pool together once again, they're basically bringing the inheritance back together and reverting it to how it was before when it was a tfisas habayis. And therefore, in that case, they would be chayiv in maaser behaymah, but patur from the kalbon. So again, says Rav Anan, that when they divide up the estate in such a way that, like, Reuven gets all the goats and Shimon gets all the sheep, well, in that case, we can't say for sure, it's not like a proper inheritance. Reuven isn't necessarily getting his inheritance, Shimon isn't necessarily getting his inheritance, but they divided it up, they made an evaluation, they made calculations, and they said, look, this is what's fair. When they then pool their resources together and bring it all back together, well, they're bringing it together as a business transaction, as business partners. However, says Rav Anan, if they divide up everything 50-50, each one gets 50% of the sheep and each one gets 50% of the goats, we'll say, actually, each one is getting their true inheritance. Each one is getting what they are supposed to be getting as the inheritance. And when they pool their resources together, so then they're basically bringing their inheritance back together. And therefore, we don't treat it as a business partnership, we treat it as the tfisas habayis, as the original inheritance. And therefore, as business partners, if we say that they're business partners, they would be pater from maaser behaymah, but chayiv in the kalbon. If we say that it's their inheritance, the tfisas habayis, so then they'll be chayiv in maaser behaymah, but pater from the kalbon. Now, Rav Nachman Omer says, Rav Nachman, afilu chalku gedim keneged gedim utzloim keneged tzloim. Even if we divide up the goats with the goats and the sheep with the sheep, so Reuven gets 50% of the sheep, Shimon gets 50% of the sheep, Reuven gets 50% of the goats, Shimon gets 50% of the goats. Ein omrim, we don't say zechelko amagio misha rishon l'chach. We don't say brayrah. Rav Nachman says, no, even if Reuven gets 50% of the sheep and 50% of the goats, and Shimon gets 50% of the sheep and 50% of the goats, it doesn't matter. We are not going to argue that Reuven is getting the portion that he was supposed to get all along, and Shimon is getting the portion that he was supposed to get all along, and therefore when they come back together, it's really just going back to the tfisas habayis, bringing the inheritance back together. Rav Nachman says, we don't know that. We can't say that. We have no way of knowing that Reuven maybe didn't get Shimon's portion, and Shimon maybe didn't get Reuven's portion. We have no way. We can't say brayrah. We can't go back in time and say that Memele Reuven got what he was supposed to get all along and Shimon got what he was supposed to get all along. We can't know that for sure. We can't say brayrah. And therefore, we can't know for sure that Reuven got his inheritance and Shimon got his inheritance. And we have to view it as though Reuven got certain assets, Shimon got certain assets. When they come back together and pull it together, they're coming in as a business partnership, that Reuven's bringing his assets to the business, Shimon's bringing his assets to the business, and they're partners. So while Rav Anan is willing to say brayrah, to say that when you divide everything up 50-50 and then pull it back together, it goes back, reverts to being the tfisas habayis, bringing the inheritance back together, Rav Nachman says we can't say brayrah. And therefore, even when everything's divided 50-50, we have no way of knowing that, each one's getting their inheritance that was rightly theirs. Rather, each one got 50% of certain assets, and now they're bringing those assets together and pulling it together as partners. But we can't say brayrah. Wow. So that was all a long-winded way of saying that according to Rav Nachman, he does not hold a brayrah. So tying that back in, when you have Reuven and Shimon who are unable to get benefit from one another, and now they come to this pit in, this pilgrim pit that is jointly owned by everybody, so then how would, we're saying in the, a Beitzah, that they'd be allowed to go to the pilgrim pit. Right, Reuven and Shimon can't get benefit from each other, but they'll be allowed to go to the pilgrim pit and fill up water. The question is, how? If we're saying that the pilgrim pit is owned by everybody, how could Reuven and Shimon be getting benefit from the pilgrim pit if that means that they'll be getting benefit from each other? Rav Nachman, initially, we wanted to answer for him by saying, well, when he chaps around the water, he's chapping around his water. But how can he know for sure? Maybe he's chapping around Shimon's water. And Rav Nachman clearly doesn't hold a brayrah, as we see by this complicated case with the inheritance. So Elo, so rather, what Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes are arguing about, everyone agrees that the pit is hefker. And because the pit is hefker, that is why even when Reuven and Shimon are unable to get benefit from each other, they could still grab water from the pit, because they could, bathe in the pit, drink water from the pit, whatever they want, because it's hefker. It doesn't belong to anybody. It doesn't belong to Reuven, doesn't belong to Shimon, doesn't belong to anybody. Therefore, they could both use it. Now, if that's the case, how could Rav Nachman say that when Reuven fills up water for Shimon, that it's defined by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos? I thought when Reuven fills up the water, it'll automatically belong to him, and it'll be defined by his Tchum Shabbos if we're saying that the pit is hefker. So that's exactly the machlokas. The machlokas is, when Reuven fills up water from a hefker pit for Shimon, do we say that he immediately takes ownership of it and immediately it's defined by his Tchum Shabbos, like Rav Shesha says? Or is it possible that when Reuven fills up the water from the pit in order to give it to Shimon, that it does, right, the ownership becomes deferred, that it doesn't immediately become Reuven's, but rather it becomes nobody's until he gives it to Shimon, and then it becomes Shimon's. So Rav Nachman says that it can work like that, that even if you have a hefker pit and Reuven fills up water for Shimon, it doesn't automatically become Reuven's. Rather, when he gives it to Shimon, it becomes Shimon's. Therefore, it's defined by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. Friends, that was Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Beitzah. All right, friends, what do we talk about on Daf Lamed Tes? Well, we talked about taking out coals from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim. We said that in terms of Tchum Shabbos, a coal is limited by where the owner could take it, but the flame, if you light a flame from somebody, you could take that flame anywhere. It's not a flame itself is not limited by anybody's Tchum Shabbos. Then we said that in terms of Hotza'ah, however, if you kind of like blow a spark from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, you'll be potter. But if you take out a flame, even if it's on like a small little wood chip, you will be chayiv for taking out that flame. That was Rav Shesh's opinion, who says that you're chayiv when you put it on a wood chip. Abaye explains that you'll be chayiv when you put it on some pottery and you kind of put oil and light the flame from the pottery. Then we got to this interesting Mishnah that says that if you have a pit belonging to a fellow, so then anybody who fills up water from that pit, the Tchum Shabbos is based on the pit of the fellow. And then we also said that if the pit belongs to a particular city, so then the Tchum Shabbos is defined by that city. And then we said that the pits of the Olei Bavel are defined by whoever fills up the water. Whoever fills up the water, he is limited by the water can only travel as far as the filler upper can go. Then we got to this interesting question of, well, what if Reuven fills up from the pilgrim pit water for Shimon? Rav Nachman said, okay, so it's defined by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. Rav Shesha says, no, it's defined by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos, Reuven who filled it up. The question is, what exactly is the machlokas between them? Initially, we wanted to say, well, Rav Nachman holds that the pit is jointly owned by everybody. The pilgrim pit is jointly owned by everybody. And therefore, Shimon can send Reuven as his messenger to fill up his portion of the water and give it to him. Whereas Rav Shesha says it's not like that. Rather, the water in the pit is ownerless, and therefore, when Reuven fills up the water, memele, it is going to become Reuven's, and it's going to be defined by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. We then ask kashas on Rav Nachman, first by saying that, well, we know that in a case where Reuven and Shimon are not allowed to get benefit from one another, yet we know that they would be allowed to get benefit from this pilgrim pit. And if it's jointly owned by everybody, wouldn't Reuven then memele be getting benefit from Shimon? So first we wanted to say, well, Rav Nachman holds a brayrah, that we could say brayrah, and that when Reuven fills up water from the pit, he's actually memele filling up his own water, not Shimon's water. And therefore, that's why it can work in that case. But the pilgrim pit really is jointly owned. We then brought a question against Rav Nachman to argue that no, he does not hold of brayrah. And we brought that kasha from this sort of very detailed example of these brothers, Reuven and Shimon, who divide up their father's inheritance, but then pull back the assets. That Rav Anon says that if they divide up the assets 50-50, well then we can assume that each person got what they were meant to get, what was really theirs in the first place, i.e. we say brayrah, and therefore when they rejoin their assets, it kind of goes back, reverts to being the tfisas habayis, whereas Rav Nachman says, no, we cannot say brayrah, and therefore even when they divide it up 50-50, it just becomes like more of a business thing. When they bring it back together, they're going into business together, not reverting back to their inheritance, because who's to say that they actually got their true inheritance in the first place? So we see that Rav Nachman does not hold of brayrah. So then how can we explain the situation where the Reuven and Shimon are allowed to get benefit from the pilgrim pit if it's jointly owned by everybody? Isn't Reuven going to be getting benefit from Shimon? So therefore we say, no, the pilgrim pit, actually everybody agrees that it's hefker. That's why Reuven's allowed to get benefit from the pilgrim pit, even if he can't get benefit from Shimon, because the pilgrim pit is ownerless. If that's the case, then if Reuven is filling up water for Shimon, wouldn't Reuven immediately become the owner? How could it be governed by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos? So we say, well, that's precisely the argument about when you have hefker, and Ruvain, takes from the hefker for Shimon, can you do that? Rav Shesha says, look, when the pit is hefker and Ruvain fills up the water for Shimon, I don't care that it's for Shimon. Ruvain fills up the water, he becomes the owner, it's governed by his Tchum Shabbos. Whereas Rav Nachman says, no. When Ruvain fills up the water from the pit, we kind of defer the ownership, right? When Ruvain fills up water from the pit for Shimon, we kind of defer ownership until it's transferred to Shimon. Shimon then becomes the owner, and it's governed by him. It's governed by his Tchum Shabbos. Friends, that was the Aflamet Test of Masechta Beitzah. I hope you enjoyed. Peace.